Hi guys, we are looking at Hosea chapter 4 today. It's a nice day, so we're outside. But in Hosea chapter 3, as we went through last time, God told the prophet Hosea to redeem his unfaithful wife Gomer. So he also promises in that chapter a new time for Israel in the future, wherein they will return to the Lord and seek him through David's final king, Jesus Christ. So that's good news, but Hosea chapter 4 is not such good news. It's a message of judgment, and God is the accuser of his people. So in Hosea chapter 4, God lays out the sin of his people, and he accuses them of their collective iniquity and wrongdoing here. So God begins by telling his children that his beef is with them. He accuses them of having no faithfulness, no steadfast love, and no knowledge of God. So 3 times God references their lack of knowledge as the reason not only for their blatant sin against him, but for their own destruction, which is coming. His rejection of them, which again is coming, and the coming consequences of punishment and judgment in general. So we'll read a few verses. Here are the 3 times that I noted when I read this, of God talking to his people about their lack of knowledge as a direct correlation to their own destruction and their own demise coming. So it says this in Hosea 4 verse 1. Hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel, for the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or steadfast love and no knowledge of God in the land. So that's the first time we hear there's no knowledge of God. He's talking to his own children, his own people. They should have known. They did know the scriptures, but they had deliberately forgotten them and turned aside to their own ways. So, and deliberately disobeyed what God had already told and instructed them. So then we see in verse 6, Hosea 4 verse 6, it says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. So here's the reason for their destruction, their lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, you didn't want it, I reject you from being a priest to me. And since you have forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children. And lastly, the 3rd time we hear it in this chapter, he says, I will not punish your daughters when they play the whore, nor your brides when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go aside with prostitutes and sacrifice with cult prostitutes. And a people without understanding shall come to ruin. Hosea 4:14. So again, we hear it. A people without understanding shall come to ruin. And just a little context, obviously they were steeped in sexual sin, pagan idolatry, the fertility religion. They were worshiping through sex and orgies and drunkenness and all of these things that God hated, that God had instructed them to stay away from. So when he says, I'm not going to punish your daughters when they play the whore and your brides when they commit adultery, what he's saying there is, you're all guilty. I'm not just going to punish the women like you men want, because, obviously the culture was such that if women did this, obviously they were put to death, but men kind of got a pass. Well, God's saying, I'm not going to punish them. You're all going to get it. And judgment is coming for these sins in your rejection of my truth, in my ways, in my knowledge that I have freely given to you. So that was Hosea 4:14. I would encourage you to read the entire chapter in context because it's short and it's helpful. So, but we see here, God identifies the sin of his people as primarily sexual in nature. He actually lists their sins, I believe it's in verse 2, as swearing, lying, murder, stealing, and adultery. So that's the list we get, but continually throughout this passage and throughout this book, obviously Hosea with his unfaithful wife is the whole backdrop here. Sexual sin is what he's really highlighting here. He's referencing their sexual sin continually, and especially in this chapter, as whoring, adultery, prostitution, drunkenness. And he says they're operating from a, quote, spirit of whoredom. So you can look at Hosea 4 verses 2, verses 10 through 15, and verse 18. But again, I would just say read it all in context. But so not only were they physically, sexually immoral, they were doing these things, prostitution, adultery, all of it. But God is comparing that prostitution and that whoredom as an idolatry of worshiping another god. Like they're prostituting themselves spiritually to other gods by physically doing these behaviors and these sexual sins, among other sins, because they all are interconnected and they're all equally dark. So 3 times then we hear God mention the punishment and the rejection to come along with Israel's sin, or because of their sin. So if you look at Hosea 4 verses 3, 5, and 9, God lays the blame at the feet of the priests and the prophets. So foremost, we're looking at the leaders here. In verses 4 and 5, you can see that because they were those who were most responsible. The more you know, right? The more you know, the more you're responsible for. What did Peter Parker say? With great power comes great responsibility, right? So he's talking to the priests and the prophets. They were most responsible for teaching, correcting, rebuking the people of God when they went astray. And they were most certainly going astray. But what were the priests and the prophets doing? Now, we're not going to talk about Hosea because he was obviously listening to God and speaking God's words and doing God's will. But for the most part, by and large, even those God had placed in spiritual leadership and authority were complicit and silent on matters of brazen sexual sin, ubiquitous adultery, prostitution, all of these idol behaviors, and all types of degenerate behavior against God's standards. So, reminds me of something else, maybe our culture, where you have, by and large, a majority of Christian leaders who are not speaking out against these sins and these behaviors, but rather are complicit or silent, which if you're silent, you're complicit, or even accepting of these things. And so God's pointing at his leaders first, and he's saying, you guys, I reject you as my priests and my prophets. Not only is he rejecting and punishing his people, or going to, he's starting with his own house. So God's punishments are listed as being rejected by him, God forgetting their children, and the land, air, field, and sea being void of life. So these are some pretty harsh judgments. Maybe you don't care about what happens to you, but do you really want God to forget your child, to not care about your child, to not bring your child into his family and his covenant? Like maybe that'll, get them to repent. But likewise, 3 times God mentions the shame of his people, saying, I will change their glory into shame. And when their drink is gone, they give themselves to whoring. Their rulers dearly love shame, and they shall be ashamed because of their sacrifices. So if you look at Hosea 4, 7, 18, and 19, you see 3 mentions of their shame. So just to reiterate, when God says something 3 times, we know it's important. He wants us to consider it and remember it and put it in our mind. In this passage, we have 3 warnings that a lack of the knowledge of God leads to sin and death. We have 3 warnings of the coming consequences of forgetting the knowledge of God. And we have 3 instances citing the shame that accompanies living without the knowledge and the fear of God. So this is a pretty dark and dismal message, but it's meant to be a warning. Like, get this in your mind, guys. When you do these things, this is what's going to come. You're going to be ashamed. You're going to be having consequences that you don't want. Your children are going to be forgotten, right? God is removing his blessing and covering and protection from you because of these things that you are willfully doing. So, still true today, still true for us, but surely, in my estimation, I'm just an amateur here, but surely God wasn't just using the prophet Hosea to warn the people prior to Christ's coming what happens when we stop worrying about what God's word says. I wonder maybe if he wanted us today to read this and remember what happened to them as a result of their lack of spiritual knowledge. And it's not just knowledge, because you could have knowledge. It's having knowledge and putting it into practice and applying it. Because a lot of these people, the people of God, they were the ones who had the truth. They knew what God expected and what God wanted and what God called them to. But they deliberately turned away, forgot, and turned to other gods and other ideas. And that's what led them astray. So if we look around, just look around, look at the so-called spiritual leaders of our own culture. And it's not all of them. Obviously, we had the prophet Hosea here, and he's still speaking to us today. But by and large, the majority, the spiritual leaders of our own culture, if you look around, do they truly teach, preach, correct, rebuke the sins in the world that is around, in the world that is everything that the world is steeped in right now? If that's not happening, then you would do well to find another spiritual leader, another church, another pastor, another whatever, because he's just going to lead you astray if he's silent or complicit on these matters. Especially, as we see here, the matters of brazen sexual sin, all types of degenerate behavior that go against God's standards. At the very least, a spiritual leader should be speaking against these things. Are we doing that? Do most people that you know right now today have a solid understanding and a deep knowledge of the things of God in his word? And are they putting those things into practice? We need to look at our own culture and our own sphere of influence and ask ourselves these questions, because they're important. Because what's the alternative? My people die for a lack of knowledge. My people are destroyed for a lack of understanding, right? So, or are we just drowning in useless information and head knowledge and ungodly behavior? I think we can all look around and see what type of culture we're living in right now. So I don't think it was just for the people of Hosea's time. I think it was for us too. And Hosea was warning God's people about these things. So I think we would do well to do the same and to take heart to his message. I don't know what you think, but I thought that was a helpful chapter. I hope it was helpful for you, and we'll see you next time with Hosea chapter 5.